Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Teresa Hall, and I'll be the facilitator for today's webinar. I serve as the SVP of Customer Operations at Project Lead the Way. As we begin, please introduce yourselves in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. The STEM Ally webinar series is a collaboration between Project Lead the Way and EdWeek. Project Lead the Way is a national nonprofit that believes learning by doing helps prepare students for a STEM-driven world. And through our project-based curriculum, best-in-class professional development, and grants for curriculum adoption, we support teachers in all 50 states to create an environment to make every student in every grade STEM successful. Learn more about us at PLTW.org. If you're interested in earning CEUs for attending today's webinar, EdWeek is providing them to all participants. Certificates of completion are available to all registered live attendees who attend 53 minutes or more of this webinar. Your certificate will be emailed to you. EdWeek recommends you verify with your school, district, county, or state that the PD will qualify for your CEUs. Today, we've invited 5 amazing educators who are focused on personalized learning in the STEM classroom. These 5 experts will share strategies and examples of student-centered learning. Before we get started, I'm going to share a few tips on how to maximize your webinar experience. Join the conversation. Share your expertise, strategies, examples, stories, and experience, and ask questions by engaging with fellow participants and our presenters. If you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A tab. If you are having any audio trouble during the webinar, please check the audio setting on your computer as well as your speaker volume setting. If you're still having issues, please see our detailed audio troubleshooting file available in the resource list under the Q&A window. If the console freezes or you hear music after the presentation has begun, please refresh your browser. Read about today's speakers in the speaker bio window. Download a copy of today's slides from the resource list. Follow the conversation about today's webinar on X using the hashtag #EWWebinar. An on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. Both the archive and a free-to-download version of the slides will be accessible through edweek.org or using the same login you used today. And now the exciting part, time to jump in. Here is our agenda for today. First, we'll have each presenter introduce themselves and share their definition of personalized learning. Then we'll have 3 sections, including examples from the field, strategies to try out, and guidance for newbies. We also hope to have time for questions from you at the end. Presenters, thank you so much for being here today. I would love for you to briefly introduce yourself and share how you define personalized learning. First up is Claire.
Hi, I'm 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐬, Magnet Coordinator at Lead STEM Academy in Las Vegas, Nevada. Unofficially, I was introduced to personalized learning when I was introduced to project-based learning. I didn't realize it was considered personalized learning, but the more I advocate for PBL, the more I learn that it is personalized learning. PBL is personalized learning because it allows students to take ownership over their learning and drive students to inquire deeper about a topic, and it may take them in a direction that was not anticipated by the instructor, but may actually lead them to deeper learning. I define personalized learning by learning that allows students to have voice and choice, learning that allows students to pursue areas of interest while learning the content, and learning that meets students where they are while supporting their goals.
Fantastic, thank you. Peter, you're up next.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation, both EdWeek and PLTW. And for those of us on the western side of the country, good morning. My name is Peter Boyle. I am a former teacher and principal of a STEM school, and I am currently Senior Director for Education at the Center for the Future of Arizona. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit whose mission is to bring Arizonans together to build a stronger and brighter future for our state. We have direct work in education, workforce, and civic engagement, and we believe it's really important to ask Arizonans what matters the most to them and get their preferred solutions for our state's challenges, which gets to our introduction into personalized learning and my definition. So when we ask Arizonans, what do you care about and what do you want to see in our education system, the vast majority want schools to have the flexibility instructionally and through curriculum and assessment to personalize learning to meet the needs of all students. And so that led us to launch the Arizona Personalized Learning Network with our partners at KnowledgeWorks and district partners, and gets me to my definition for personalized learning, which is learning that puts students in the driver's seat, or mixing a metaphor a little bit, at least in the co-pilot seat of their own education instead of being passive passengers, as so many are used to.
Thank you so much. 𝐲𝐿.
Thanks, 𝐲𝐿. I serve as a Director of Teaching and Learning at KnowledgeWorks. We are a national education nonprofit based in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we work with learning communities across the United States to support them in the spread and scale of personalized competency-based learning. And so when we talk about personalized learning, we use this larger term, which encompasses personalized learning, called personalized competency-based learning. And so we really break down some of the strategic elements of what that is. Again, one of the primary facets is personalized learning. And so when we talk about that, we often define it as engaging learners and creating experience for learners that are customized to their strengths, to their interests, more importantly, to their needs. We then couple that with competency-based learning, which allows for educators to create flexible pathways, to differentiate the learning supports for learners, and to really identify multiple means to demonstrate, to create alongside students multiple means for them to demonstrate their skill development, or we might call mastery. And so those things kind of coupled together, ideally kind of puts educators in the driver's seat to really center the education and the learning experiences to that learner's strengths, to their needs, to their interests, and again, to provide the supports necessary for them to do what it is they want to do, or what we might say for them to be ready for graduation, or ready for what's next in the world.
Yeah, fantastic. Great. Heather, you're up.
Hello, I'm Heather Townley. I live in Toledo, Ohio, and my current title is Coordinator of Gifted STEM and Personalized Learning at the ESC of Lake Erie West. I was introduced to personalized learning when I was lucky enough to be selected as one of 10 Ohio personalized learning specialists under a grant through our Ohio Department of Education and Workforce back in 2022. That grant was earmarked to develop a personalized learning framework in Ohio through a partnership with ODEW, but also KnowledgeWorks, that's how I know Dion, and educational service centers across the state. During those 2 years, we onboarded hundreds of educators. We developed an approved framework that's on ODEW's website, which is very exciting, and that is being used in learning spaces all over Ohio. So how do I define personalized learning? I define it as a learner-driven approach to education that empowers students to take ownership of their learning. So obviously this definition comes directly from the language that was developed to guide the work in Ohio over the last 2 years. I'm a big fan of learning my news from TikTok. So to be true with the TikTok trend, if you ask me at a deeper level, I would say personalized learning is everything I believe in as an educator. It's putting what matters to young people at the forefront to really help them grow to be thinkers and creators in our future world. Our learning spaces should be for all, and it should be adaptable to the needs of all. And just one example, looking at the research that came out of the Renzulli Center at the University of Connecticut, because I also have a background in gifted. And that research really showed that when learners are taken out of the classroom because like their needs can't be met here, they have to be met somewhere else, they see slower or even stalled growth. And so really the world has changed. I could go on and on. In the last 100 years, it's time that our schools start at a systems level really make that change too.
Wow, I already feel like I've learned so much just from your all introductions. Thank you again for being here and for sharing your knowledge and expertise with this audience. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about Project Lead the Way as we dip into examples from the field now. So Project Lead the Way personalizes STEM learning through its student-centered approach, focusing on individual strengths, weaknesses, and interests. A key component of this is their activity project problem-based approach, or APB. You'll see that at pltw.org a lot, which empowers students to take ownership of their learning by choosing real-world problems they want to solve. This method not only builds critical thinking and problem-solving skills, but also fosters creativity and collaboration. By allowing students to explore problems that resonate with their passions, PLTW's APB approach exemplifies personalized learning, helping students connect their unique interests to meaningful STEM experiences and prepares them for their future. I would love now to hear from presenters with examples from the field of how personalized learning is implemented in STEM classrooms. Claire, could you get us started?
I can. One example that we do at 𝐲𝐨𝐻 Academy actually came from PLTW and design and modeling. We do a STEM tank each semester, and each semester students are given a theme. For example, this semester is natural disaster mitigation, and they decide what problem within that overarching theme they are going to solve. They then work through the design process in teams to come up with a solution. And at the end of the semester, they present that solution to community members. So they're able to drive their own learning within that theme and work through the design process, all inspired by PLTW.
That's great. Thank you so much. Dion, could you share an example from the field?
Yeah, so at KnowledgeWorks, again, we spend a lot of our time really working with folks like Heather and Peter to build the capacity of others to really to shift their learning culture, their learning ecosystem to be more learner-centered and learner-centric. And so a part of that is sometimes folks want to develop out competencies. And so Ohio has a competency framework that the Department of Education Workforce has, and it's published. And so educators are able to utilize those competencies in real time to create learning experiences with their students that are STEM related. And so some of those examples that exist generally find themselves in like a project-based space. And so if folks are using competencies, some of them might be lead inquiry, where folks are able to engage in scientific investigation or experimental design. They're able to do research design. They're able to talk about and think about how to colonize Mars or how to produce farms in their backyards in rural communities. And so again, I think that as Claire mentioned, how do we begin to put learners in a position to create and design real world projects that solve actual issues in their communities? And so a lot of times what we see is folks taking competencies and designing project-based or place-based learning experiences that allow for them to actualize and master skills at their own pace and time. And again, opportunities for them to really show through their own methods, how they've mastered that skill and really what that means for them.
That's great. Thank you so much. Heather, it would be great to hear some experiences from the field from you.
I have a couple of things I wanted to share. Is it okay if I share both now, or would you prefer just like one?
Absolutely, we can share both now.
Okay, perfect. So one of my kind of easiest entry points that I like to talk about is using SOPs in a learner-centered space. And they work so well in STEM learning spaces, and you'll see why as I talk about it briefly. So SOPs, or standard operating procedures, first of all, is that fun cross between like the workforce world and our educational spaces. And this example that's on the screen right now is from iSTEM, which is a school in Painesville, Ohio. It really highlights the elevation of learner voice by you just ask the question. You just say, as a learner in this class, what should I do when I don't know what to do? And then the kids designed this. Well, you could look it up, or you could check Schoology, or you could ask a friend, and you can see as they go through this chart, at the end, if all else fails, just ask Mrs. Hamilton. But all of these steps that can be taken to start solving their problems on their own and using the resources that they have. Another example is, what should we be doing during arrival and dismissal? And then if you could just click to the next one, I would love to show those. And we don't have to go through each of them in great detail, but you can see they're kind of messy and they're up on the wall. And it's because the class identified we have this problem and it's stalling our ability to do what we want to do in this moment, or making things take longer than they should. And we think, and these are usually generated by the learners themselves, I think we need an SOP for that. And then suddenly your room is covered in these SOPs that your class designed. And it does not take a lot of time. It takes no technology, and it's a great way to shift some ownership. Another example that I would love to share with you is from a forensic science teacher at Clay High School that's in Oregon, Ohio. I got to spend some time with Beth over the last couple of years. She, of course, is the coolest teacher because she teaches forensic science, but also she's an incredible innovator. This is the single piece of paper that she gives to her learners at the beginning of a unit. And you can see the learning objectives down the side, and then also what they're that they'll have a presentation for those last two learning objectives. And this is what's wild. She gives them this sheet. They have resources like labs, notes, lectures, videos, academic articles, books, to go do the work, to go learn the things, to get to mastery in all of these learning objectives. And then once they feel as though they've mastered every objective, not only can they start on their presentation preparation, but they just go to her and say, I'm ready to show my mastery. And she keeps multiple copies of this document. She highlights in different colors. Again, like no tech to do this. She takes out a highlighter. She picks 5 different colors and highlights through and says to the learner, what color do you want? They have no idea what learning objectives they're going to have to prove mastery of. And they go and they go through the learning objective and show their level of knowledge. And if they're struggling on something or weren't really fully prepared, she can give them notes to kind of go back. Why don't you look at this lab again? Or why don't you go check out those lecture notes? And there's so many examples in here of personalized learning with pacing, and they're making their own choices. They're using the resources that they prefer. They're really owning that space, and it's incredible to watch.
That's amazing. I want to be in that class. That looks like so much fun. Yes, seems amazing. Peter, I know you have a couple of examples to share as well. Could you share your first one now?
Will do, thanks. And I would just like to say I would also like to be in the forensic science class as we're enrolling for that too. So our Arizona Personalized Learning Network districts really support student agency because the research is clear. When students have more agency, more voice and choice in their learning, they are more successful, and that's true at any age. So you can look here at my first example, which is a student or classroom level example. This is a student-led tracking document. It's powerful for students to set and reflect on their own goals and track their mastery, similar to what Heather shared in terms of tracking progress throughout a project, but it's most powerful when students really either demonstrate their mastery or hear their own insights. So you can see in this document, different essential learning outcomes for 4th grade language arts writing are on the left-hand side. And then at the top row, it has different levels of mastery. Starting on the left, even with help, I still don't understand, all the way to the right, I can teach someone else how to do this. Students actually keep track of their own mastery using this tool, demonstrating their agency, It's very much aligned with the ownership of learning, as other presenters have mentioned. And it can be easily tailored for any content area or used as a tool to track progress in project-based learning classrooms. So that's my first example.
That's great. So I'm going to jump around a little bit, so I hope we can catch up with the slides, but I'd love to go back and hear another example from Claire.
Sorry. Actually, mine piggybacks with what he was just saying. We do an untraditional tracking of learning in our CTE pathways, trying to take that pressure of getting the grade and that passive learning of, you know, the grade is given to me. I'm earning it because they want these particular points, not, hey, I learned this and this is how I know I learned it. So we actually have a couple of different versions of the forensic class and that tracking of learning that was just shown, where, yeah, a 4 in our scale is I can teach it to somebody else. That's the highest level of understanding. So that's one thing we're doing is, you know, the teacher and the student together are deciding what is their level of understanding in that content for that marking period. So there's only one grade given, not accumulation of grades throughout the entire quarter. The other thing that we're doing is just hands-on project-based learning in our RCT classrooms. So both those things, working through the design process and untraditional tracking of learning, is my second example.
That's fantastic. I love the way you said that students can say, I learned this, and this is how I know I learned this. Terrific example of agency right there as well. Dion, I think you have another example to share too.
Yes, and it actually dovetails nicely with your point around learner agency. And so one of the key elements of the Ohio Personalized Learning Framework is authentic learning, and a huge part of that is creating personalized pathways and experiences that are learner driven, and really allowing learners to co-design and facilitate authentic and meaningful learning experiences. And so an example from Ohio. What is Eastview Elementary School in Avon Lake. And at this school, they focused on force and motion, which I think is pretty great. And it's really great because it wasn't just like learners said, hey, we're interested in this, and teachers also supporting that, but parents also volunteered and spent their mornings and afternoons at the school really helping to support the stations that they had around force and motion. And so students were able to conduct things like speed tests and magnetic exploration of movement exploration. They were given various tools to support their hypotheses, to test those things. But again, it really is a nod to this framework that really put educators in a really great position to really leverage theory around, well, how do we really put into practice one of the key elements of personalized learning, which is learner-centeredness and learner agency. And so how do we start to say, hey, what are you interested in terms of science or technology or engineering or mathematics? And then how do we really bring that to life in fun and meaningful and engaging ways that allow for you to develop skills and reach mastery in authentic and meaningful experiences. And so this is a very community-based project. And it was really great to hear the teachers talk about it during our convening. I know Heather probably also has a lot of examples to share, but it was really nice to hear them talking about it and the fun and the joy that came out of it.
Those are great examples from the field. We're going to close out this section with one more from Peter. I have a feeling you all have examples we could do a whole webinar on just those, but let's finish up this section with Peter.
Thanks, Teresa. My last example just is a nod to the fact that CFA works with districts as well in a systems-based approach to transforming teaching and learning too. And so this is aligned with the importance of rigorous targets for learning in a personalized learning system. At the district level, it can also be at the school level or several states at the state level. There has been the adoption of portraits of a graduate or portraits of a learner. This is one example from Arizona, one of our larger school districts. And these documents describe the competencies that Dion was referring to earlier in the personalized competency-based learning approach that are aligned with 21st century job skills. And so the invitation, or really the expectation in schools, districts, or states with a portrait of a graduate or a portrait of a learner is that each of the activities or assessments that students complete is an opportunity to demonstrate mastery or demonstrate progress towards these different competencies. And so that's another tool or a strategy at the systems level that can really spur personalized and competency-based learning adoption.
Yeah, fantastic. Those stories from the field were very inspirational. It makes me want to visit all of your places and all of the ways you've seen this work done. Now we're going to move on to our second section here, strategies to try out. So we appreciate all of those examples and bringing those concepts of personalized learning and STEM classrooms to life. Now that that stage is set, let's share some strategies. I know you all have a lot of them to share. So going first, I think we'll stick with Claire going first.
Sounds good. First and foremost, the biggest strategy to start with is building relationships in the classroom. Getting to know your students on a personal level helps you to personalize learning. This can be done in a variety of ways, including just, quick attendance check-ins to find out what they're interested in. I created a coaching culture in my classroom, and I taught computer science for the last 4 years that I was teaching. And so kids just knew, their level 4 was that they could help somebody else. And so they knew if they didn't understand something, they could be coached from somebody else, with the understanding that you're not always the coached. You can become the coach, right? So I'd hear somebody getting some help from somebody else, hear somebody say, oh, I don't understand this. I'm like, oh, so-and-so, you were just coached on that. Can you coach them next, right? And giving up that control of always being the expert as the teacher and allowing your students to become the expert, as well as giving up that control that you don't always know everything, and that's okay. And tell the kids that you're learning together is definitely creating that culture to have personalized learning.
Yeah, that's incredible. I heard you talk about building relationships, you with students, but that coaching culture certainly creates building relationships with each other as well. So Heather, I would love to hear from you now.
I would actually love to piggyback on what Claire just said. The use of learner profiles and a little bit of what Peter said too, they're looking at kind of that district level, but that actual learner level using profiles is a great way to just begin that culture of personalized learning in a classroom space. So not only is that giving every individual in the room a chance to celebrate themselves, but it also kind of plants that seed that everyone in this space is important, no matter who you are, where you come from. And so the example on the screen, this is out of my friends at Cardinal Stritch Academy in Oregon, Ohio, just outside of Toledo, implemented these learner profiles. And when I think about instructing through the lens of STEM pedagogy, I believe that really knowing your learners and your learners really knowing themselves is just incredibly important. So when we think about this use of learner profiles, teachers that I've worked with have said, well, it's really easy to do these learner profiles with the older kids. They kind of know who they are as a learner. They're able to reflect on that. But this was done with K2, which is awesome. And a reminder that even little kindergartners need the opportunity to express who they are as learners and what their needs are. They had really high levels of engagement and success with this. And then beyond sending that message of just belonging and building the culture in the classroom, they used this to continue to design instruction, and they revisited this throughout the school year because, man, there's a big difference between a brand new kindergartner and an almost first grader. So this was then used to really design the instruction, and the kids knew that too, which I think makes it really successful. So try those out for sure.
Yeah, that's incredible. I began my career as an elementary teacher, so I hear that about the littlest ones driving their learning as well. So Peter, it'd be great to hear from you now around this topic.
Sure. My first kind of strategy to suggest is to ask students. If we are just continuing with that metaphor of students being in the driver's seat, or at least the co-pilots, I think it's really important, once you've built those relationships and built that culture, as other folks have mentioned, that there's a continued dialogue in the classroom space. What are you interested in? where can we go next in terms of the next project, the next topic for study? What are some resources that you like to learn from, right? All of those are different, I think, conversation starters. We know that students, when they have the opportunity to share how they learn best, will tell you, and then are ultimately more successful. So I think my first strategy is to really just open up the conversation and ask students how they'd like the classroom environment to look in this way.
Yeah, fantastic. Students always tell us when we ask, don't they? Dion, can you share an example now?
Yes, I echo and concur with so many of the examples said, and I think just to kind of continue, I would say be creating transparency, a transparent culture, but particularly like an asset-based culture, and the culture that activates prior knowledge. And I think, when I first started teaching, I was like, I'm gonna hold all the things, including the standards and the competencies, and we're just gonna go through this learning experience. But learners really want to know, hey, what are we doing now? But also, what are we doing tomorrow? And what are we doing next week? And why does all this matter? And so when we're thinking about standards, we're thinking about competencies. One example of standard might be to classify organisms as producers or consumers. And I might tie that in and say, well, what's a competency that connects to that, where learners are able to do, again, I'll go back to lead inquiry. I can use tools and technology or models to identify and explain important relationships pertaining to consumption and production and biological communities. But what are we really asking them to do? And, a part of that is, again, showing this to the learner and really converting standards to I can statements, one. But on the other hand, what's the key terminology there? Consumption and production and decomposition or deconsumption. And, giving those things to the learners and then asking them, what is it that you want? How do we create common language? How do you understand consumption? Putting it in, and then allowing them to, again, create that in their communities, right? What does it look like for your communities to consume? And how much are they consuming? And what's the impact on that level of consumption, not just for your community, but the community next to yours or your state more largely? And so really, again, showing them all the things, giving them all the things, and then allowing for them to really take that and think about it complexly and analytically, and then saying, hey, this is how this applies to me, and this is how I want to show you that I've learned something, show you that I've found a solution to this thing. And you'll see that, one, they're learning and they're thinking, but also, again, that they're showing up with a whole lot more than I think they're often given credit for.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much. Heather, do you have another strategy to share?
I would love to add to what Dion was just saying with a resource that I believe is going to be shared in the chat. And you bring up such a great point, Dion, because at the end of the day, standards have to drive the work that we do. This isn't just like the Wild West free for all. We always have to go back to those standards. And I love when you said, like, letting the learners in on that conversation. So this strategy is really just to break down the learning standards with your learners. I got to work with teachers at a school called 𝐲𝐲𝐬 Academy. It was a project-based learning school in Holland, Ohio. And they wanted to better design pathways to support their learners, and why not do that with them? So this document, Learning Pathway Design Guide, was created during the grant work in Ohio. But the teachers worked alongside each other and their learners, all 6th through 8th grade, to better design for and with them. It was just a jumping off point, right? To have a conversation about what's the standard, what assessment could we look at to show mastery, what's your readiness, what gaps do you have in your learning? And it allowed them to kind of start talking it out. So feel free to use that if that's helpful for you.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I love how those two examples tied together. Peter, I think you're going to close us out with one more example for this section.
One that I can share is we have, this is going to use the same standard that Dion has referenced, which is, for example, maybe the standard around classifying organisms is to open up the conversation and open up the door for a topic of choice for a different project for students. So, for example, with that same standard, students can be working on different ecosystems or different environments of choice. And that might be what it looks like in a STEM classroom, and maybe in an English language arts classroom, you're working with the same standard, but you're you're working on different books, choosing a book of choice that's just right for a different student. So that's another example that I was thinking about and wanted to elevate too.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everyone. So we've covered two big topics so far with great examples and great strategies. And we're going to move into guidance for newbies. And if this is anything like I usually know it is, it's probably not just for newbies. I bet there are going to be nuggets for everyone in here. So thanks, everyone, for sharing those strategies. I'm sure these will be helpful as schools are starting up this fall. And in some schools, like here in Indiana, where I am, it's practically the midterm of first quarter already. So we're getting close to the end of time together for this webinar. But before we move to questions, really want to hear from the presenters about two pieces of guidance that you have to share with those who are new to personalized learning, especially in the STEM space, in those STEM learning environments. So Claire, can you share your advice with us now?
Sure. My first piece of advice is to just start a project. You'll learn right alongside with your students. Project-based learning / personalized learning is a bit chaotic. Heather posted those child written, anchor charts. And I just read somewhere the other day that a laminated pretty piece of something on the wall actually says learning is over, where something where kids can still add to means learning is continuous, so it's okay to be messy. It's okay to be a little less structured than a traditional model. It's okay to be louder. Obviously, you want to have a general outline of how you envision a project going, but have that clear understanding of what students need to know as they work through the project, but then allow students the freedom to show that learning how they see fit, give choice, like Peter was saying. And they might take that learning in a different direction. As long as it's within the parameters of what you needed to teach and what they needed to learn, let them go. Your plan doesn't have to be perfect to get started. I have a lot of teachers I work with who I'm like, just jump off the jumping board, right? Like they're trying to get their project completely planned out. I'm like, just start it, because your plan is going to evolve throughout the process. And there's value in telling your students that you are trying something new and letting them help you, and let them say, this could be better, or this is what we'd like to do. So that my biggest piece of advice is just to get started, and then reflect. The second piece is, as you're going, then reflect on what went well. You're always improving then your own projects and your own designs of things you want to put in the classroom by learning from that last one that you just implemented. So that's my advice.
Great. That's a great example of being vulnerable with your students too, showing them that it's okay to take those chances. Really appreciate that, Claire. Dion, what advice do you have for folks?
Yes, I agree with Claire, and to add, Rome wasn't built in a day. Start small, build gradually. Don't throw everything out that's in your tool belt. Everyone, all teachers, I think, and Heather and I got this a lot when we would start, when we work with a lot of educators in Ohio, and everyone always wants us to give them the full binder, right? Like, okay, I'm going to throw all of my pedagogical practices, and then I want you to give me everything you have, and I want to start anew. No, you have really great things that you've been doing. And so instead of really throwing everything out, like, how do you begin to integrate key elements of personalized learning in your learning experiences, right? How do I create learner agency? How do I bring in voice? How do I bring in choice? How do I create some flexible pathways? And then once you really find out what's working well, once it's been battle tested, you have the data, quantitative or qualitative, that supports it, then you can start to codify some of your systems. Oh, this worked well, but this didn't. I'm going to take this. I'm not going to do this again. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is student choice, right? I think a big part of that is, what are your learners interested in? Don't be afraid to ask them what they're interested in. Don't be afraid to ask them, even if you're like, hey, we got to do this thing, let's say it is classify organisms and we can't really not do it. Well, how do they see themselves in that standard? What are the things that they find to be most important in that standard in this particular moment? And start from there. And so really including that learner voice, as quickly as possible. I know, it's easy to be the sage on the stage and to hold all the knowledge, but I think sometimes it's okay to let things go. I talk a lot with leaders to create this green light culture for their faculty and their staff, but I think that's okay to do in the classroom, right? How do we begin to create a green light culture for learners to say, it's okay for you to say, hey, I might not want to do this, or I want to push that later because I need to start here. And so how do we build that culture? How do we build a sustainable culture that allows for that level of inclusion and equity of voice at the beginning? And I think folks have said this already, it really goes and it strengthens relationships. And you'll see that that's going to benefit you in the long run.
Yeah, fantastic. I love in the beginning how you acknowledge that folks should know that they're doing great things and they can integrate them into something new. It feels so less intimidating. Heather, how about your advice? What do you have for us?
I was frantically trying to look up an author while Deanne was talking because I always give credit to the wrong person. But you reminded me, Deanne, that no one comes to this work empty. And I always give Abby Everett credit for it because she's the first person I heard say it. But there is an author that said it. And if I was so much cooler, I would tell you who that was. Maybe my brain will remember. So thank you for that reminder, Deanne. Also, another quote for you, a lovely woman named Robin Kanan, who's a senior director of teaching and learning at KnowledgeWorks. She told me early on in my journey towards personalized learning that the first step towards implementing PL is to remember how hard teachers work. Like, we work so hard, so hard. And then after you acknowledge that, she said, determine what you are doing for, or sometimes at, your students that they could be doing themselves. And that has stayed with me and will stay with me for the rest of my educational career. The work is a class to break down a standard. Like, just try it. Have your learners design what choice might look like just for a single upcoming assessment. Just simply ask them to be more involved in their learning process. Because I have the coolest job. I got to hear Laura McGinnis, who's the Vice President of New Glenn Mission Management for Blue Origin, speak a couple weeks ago. We don't have to go into how I ended up in that room, but she shared the future of working and living in space, and that we're not far from that future. It was unbelievable to hear her speak. And certainly those working and living in space will not be asked to sit in rows and face forward and compliantly play school. So really, my piece of advice is that let's set our expectations to reflect on what that future might hold. Enter in the work where it's comfortable for you, but any way that you can start elevating voices, their voices as the most important in the room, is going to be like a positive foot forward.
That fantastic inspirational advice. Heather, I can see in the chat, and I wrote down your first quote, but someone wants to know if you can repeat that first quote. Do you remember what it was? That
no one comes to this work empty? Yes.
That's the one I'm thinking.
You gotta put it on like a sticky note. The other one is coalition of the willing. You need to find a coalition of the willing. I don't know who said that either. It wasn't me. So when all of you leave here, you say, Heather Townley said, no, I didn't. I said it was someone else and I can't remember their name.
Fantastic. I love acknowledging that no one comes to this work empty and that teachers work incredibly hard. Fantastic. So Peter, you're up. Let's hear your advice for our newbies and really probably some of our experienced folks too.
Yeah, I think mine two pieces of advice are very much aligned with what has been shared already. First is something that all of the districts we work with share, which is the importance of going slow to go fast. To re-up my driving metaphor from earlier, you probably didn't learn to drive on the freeway, right? You probably started out on a local street or something like that. And that's how anything new is in order to be most successful. And if we kind of take that down from the folks coming out from today, is just try one strategy to begin. Maybe it's maybe you're going to try just one of the techniques shared today, or something that you saw from a colleague or read in an article, or maybe you're only going to try implementing one project-based unit a quarter or during the entire school year when you're just getting started. But I think it's so important to, just as we scaffold for our students, to scaffold for ourselves as well, and really make these transformations more manageable. So I would say go slow to go fast and just try one strategy to get started.
Yeah, great. Great advice that we can do and we can take away and start tomorrow from all of you. Thank you so much for those nuggets of wisdom. I am thrilled to say we are going to have time for some questions. That doesn't always happen on our webinars, so this is really exciting. I'm going to pose the question, and then we're going to keep this a little more casual. I'm going to count on you all to jump in. I am going to guide us a little bit and have Claire start, because that's kind of our tradition already this hour. But after that, if you want to chime in, we'll just go until the question's answered, and then we'll ask another one. So the first question up is, how can educators balance personalized learning with standardized curriculum requirements? Claire, can you get this discussion started on this question?
I can. I had the question a little bit ahead of time. And so as Peter was talking, go fast to go slow. And where, Heather was talking about student voice and choice. So when we look at these things, where do you maybe need to front load some standards? Like, do they quickly need some, we got this, and this knowledge before they dig into a project where they take it down a personal path? Also, where can your standards be grouped together? So where can you see that I can get all of these things on this one project? So that's one way to balance just dissecting and breaking down those standards first.
Anyone else want to jump in and follow up with anything on that one?
Yes, I agree with what Claire is saying. I'm also thinking about the mode of learning, I think itself. Prior to coming to KnowledgeWorks, I was a director of competency-based learning at a high school in Memphis, Tennessee called Crosstown High. And we were competency-based and we were project-based and we were diverse by design. And so we had a lot of really great elements that made up our learning model. The way that we integrated the standards throughout the learning experience was that we kind of had them as the North Star, but they were woven throughout projects, right? And so we're still doing all the standards based, and we're hitting them, and we didn't even have to do the front loading on all occasions. There were instances where we had to, but for the most part, we really got together. We got our faculty together and said, disciplinarily and interdisciplinarily to say, how can you take this standard, these standards, and convert them to a project? Whether that's, looking at, again, the colonization of Mars, whether that's looking at ways to discuss issues around refugees, whether that's looking at building a bridge. How do we begin to take those standards, create real world, authentic learning experiences that learners can see themselves in, that they can see their communities in, and then hit them there. And it's interesting. Crosstown's an XQ school, and there's a film that was just released called The First Class, if anyone has time to check it out. At the beginning, you'll notice that some of the learners were like, we're not learning, right? Like, we're not learning because the learning was different. And they didn't see any of the standards. They didn't see any competencies. And they're like, we're not, what are we doing? We're not going to pass this state test. And so our science teachers administered the test after about 2 or 3 weeks, after they've kind of gone through that project cycle. And what happened? They all aced it. And they were like, wait a minute, we were learning. And yes, you are. And so, it might not look traditional. It might not look like what, they've seen in middle school or what they've seen in elementary school, depending on the grade level that they're in, but they are in fact learning. But a part of that is you want to be very intentional about the experience that you're creating, and again, being transparent around how you're converting, again, those standards and uncoupling some of the skills from the content knowledge, and then showing that to the learner so they say, okay, this is what I need, and then allowing them the opportunity to develop out an experience that allows for them to master those skills and to show mastery.
Great. I'm going to give this question one more chance. If any other of our guests want to chime in on it, I'll give it some good educator wait time, and then I'm going to jump to the next question.
I'm just going to pop in really quick with a little tip. I like a good time saver. Standards, I don't know if it's like this everywhere else. Standards are hard, you guys. When you really dig in and try to figure out all of the things and the verbs and what it wants you to do and all the prior knowledge, you get to know ChatGPT. It might be your bestie when it comes to just that initial breaking down standards a little bit. Teach your kids how to use that resource to say, like, hey, can you help me determine what skills are needed prior to mastering this standard, and have that conversation with something that's going to respond really fast and get you kind of to the work faster than you sitting at home quietly trying to stew on this over the weekend. So use some of those resources out there as time savers to kind of start setting the table for the work that the kids can do. Use it, try it out.
Fantastic. I love a good tip we can start with right this minute. Okay, this question going once, going twice. All right, here's the next one. Jump in. Whoever wants to address it, go first. Everyone will have a chance to chime in here. So the question is, what are the common challenges educators face when implementing personalized learning in STEM? There is a little follow-up to that, which is how can the challenges be addressed and overcome? Feel free to answer both, one or the other. So anybody take the wheel.
I can hop in here, and I'll start with maybe a misconception that we have encountered pretty commonly in the field, that personalizing learning means a student is on a device at all times, and maybe they're walking through, an adaptive curriculum on a device, and that is not necessarily the case. And so I think that today all of us have presented things that can be done in pretty analog ways. They can be done cross-content, they can be applied to projects, they can be applied to other methodologies of learning. But I think my overall point would be, one of the challenges is just really clearing up that mindset that this doesn't have to be a student on a computer all of the time in order to make this work. And so that's just something that we like to include in conversations when we're framing personalized or personalized competency-based learning.
Great, myth busting, always appreciated. Anybody else want to jump in with common challenges and possible solutions that educators might face when implementing personalized learning in STEM?
Classroom management, just managing, it's a personal track. So how are we making sure that I'm, checking in with the student and know what the student is doing, et cetera. And there is no, one size fits all for meeting that challenge, but just come up with your own way of documenting. When I would go around and check in on groups who were on their projects, I'd write things down so I could reference back to it. So whatever works for you, but figure out your own tracking system and your own way of keeping the calm within the organized chaos.
That sounds great. That sounds like a little bit like integrating things you already know into this as well. Like, we already are good at that in a lot of ways.
I'd like to add to something Peter said. I think it's really important to wrap your brain around some of those misconceptions. And just for like a quick little audience poll, if you could just type the number of students that you have assigned to you this year, just a few of you really quickly, so then we can make this point real when I say it out loud. Personalized learning is not individualized learning. It is not creating a lesson plan for each individual student in your learning space. I was really hoping somebody would put like their true number. 130, David, thank you so much. 540, that's wild. So that would be impossible and no one would want to go to work. So another, I guess, roadblock that you might hit is not really building your understanding of what personalized learning is truly and then diving in. So build that understanding first and set some goals so then you don't find yourself doing all of the things and burning yourself out. The other little thing that I do sometimes see when working with STEM designated schools or teachers working in STEM pedagogy is that it can get, this is a noisy space. You know your kids are learning because they're saying it out loud. And it can feel a little bit hard to let go of that control as teachers. We want to be able to say like, yep, they learned this standard and it took them this long and this is how they showed me. and it's the same for everyone because there's so many of them. There's 540. And it's okay to let go of that control a little bit because, as Peter said, like good things are going to come from that work. And so those two things are sometimes a little bit of a hiccup, but they see that it works.
Great. I think we have the perfect. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, just really quickly.
Yes.
I think that some of the things that I've seen and that were the hardest to reckon with generally found themselves in mathematics. I think generally the sciences and technology and engineering, at least in the realm of project-based learning and personalized competency-based learning, was a bit easier because you can do a science project, right? We can rebuild a bridge, and not that you don't need numbers for that, but what we found to be difficult, at least at Crosstown, was that when you looked at the traditional sequence, it was Algebra 1, and then it was geometry, and then it was Algebra 2, and we said, it's so messy, particularly as we try and figure out a way to integrate that with the project side. And so there was a shift that we took. We said, well, maybe we'll try this integrated math approach, but not just that, developing competencies that built a number sense or numeracy sense that allow for learners to really be able to understand how to talk about numbers and statistics and data in complex, nuanced ways, but also in very simplistic terms, but also to talk about them outside of that, right? And even the context of government and politics. And so really, how can we apply numbers across the board and really get them talking about numbers outside of the traditional Algebra 1 or geometry class, but also for us, again, and this might not be for everyone, we had to really reshape and rethink about what our sequence was. And really figuring out a way for us to think about all of these things, statistics and numbers and algebra and geometry, and what, I think what integrated would probably call like a math 1, right? Because we have to think about all these things sometimes as opposed to think about them independently. So how do we think about them collectively? And then start to apply those in context, again, that matter to us and allow for us to see, oh, I get how numbers apply to consumption. And I get the comparative value here, and I can make sense of that, and I can articulate that.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and ask one final question. It might put us over 3 o'clock by just a little bit, but I think the discussion and responses will be worth it. So let's talk for a little bit about what does the future hold for personalized learning in STEM education? How can educators stay ahead of all the trends, develop skills and knowledge, and really continue to innovate their teaching practices, professional learning? Someone jump in on this one for us.
I'll go.
I will. Oh.
Go ahead, Peter.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, we have future in our name, Center for the Future of Arizona, and so we try to look around corners. One of the considerations around that, though, is in reality the traditional conception of K-12 education as preparing students for the ultimate workforce. We're in a situation where we don't know the types of jobs that our students will need to be qualified for from a content perspective because they don't exist yet. To use Heather's example from ChatGPT or AI from before, I think that's 2 years old. And so our students who will be living in a world and operating in an economy in which fluency with those skills is expected is rapidly approaching. But we do know, to share the point that Dion raised earlier around competency-based learning, we do know the competencies that project-based learning or the STEM fields really cultivate. Those are ideas of inquiry, collaboration, working towards objectives, communication, communicating your findings. So I invite folks to really think about not just the content as a vehicle for personalization, but also the competencies, to use a term that we've been using throughout this hour, that students are really developing through this method of learning, through the STEM fields, and through project-based learning as well, as really some next steps that we really need to hit home to ensure students are ready for what comes next.
was a lot of what I was going to say as well. Again, you know, in Nevada, we're working on a portrait of a Nevada learner, and we're bringing those durable skills to the forefront. What do they need? Again, those competencies to be successful in an ever-changing world, the informational age. We don't know what the future holds for STEM because we don't know where it's going, right? And so I think, again, keeping up with what are those skills, not just content that they need, as well as just remembering that flexibility, that's what you're going to have to practice yourself. Is just because it's always been done this way doesn't mean that's how it needs to be done, right? And so having that mentality that I'm going to move with this, that my first year teaching is not going to look the same as my 20-year teaching, and just having that mindset, I think, is one way to keep up with that trend.
I agree with all that. And Peter mentioned this, 21st century skills. 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐬 and American Succeeds has a durable skills report that I think everyone should access. And it's worth reading every single page. But some of the essential soft skills are things like digital and numerical literacy, problem solving. You know, companies, nonprofits across the world, across the United States, are looking for some really great skills that folks already have. And I think a part of that is developing them. And what I love about STEM is that it's so closely tied to the future. When we're talking about large language models and we're talking about artificial intelligence, all of that comes out of STEM. And so prioritizing those skills reports, prioritizing and keeping your pulse on innovation and technologies, but also then coupling those with what I think are the really innovative pedagogical shifts that are fully encompassed in personalized learning will really put educators, I think, at the forefront of education innovation, because I think, you know, STEM teachers are constantly thinking about these things. So how do you become really great pedagogically, and then how do you become a really great content expert? But also then on the other side, how do you then become culture responsive and equity driven? And I think you take all of those things together, and that, you know, that is that master recipe for success. And I think, again, to conclude, again, I think STEM educators are kind of already at that on that precipice, because of the field that you're in. So continue to develop yourselves professionally, and keeping your pulse on innovations and technology. And I think you'll be in a really good place.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to our presenters for sharing your expertise and experience. And thank you for joining us today and sharing yours as well. If you'd like to watch today's presentation again, an on-demand archive will be made available through edweek.org or using today's link within the next 24 hours. You can also visit edweek.org to find articles that explore today's topic. We would like to thank EdWeek and PLTW for hosting this webinar. If you would like to find out more information about PLTW, please visit our website at www.pltw.org. We did have a request for presenters to share some contact info in the chat. So if y'all are comfortable sharing anything in there, some of these attendees really would like to reach out to you. And this concludes the presentation portion of our webinar, but we will stay on for a little bit to answer any questions you might have. Have a great rest of your day.